Welcome to Cheater Confessions. Let's get started with today's story. When I first met Carolyn, it felt easy in a way my past relationships never had. She was warm, charming, and quick to laugh. We'd been together a little over 2 years by the time everything unraveled. We weren't married yet, but the talk of the future was always around us. To her family, we looked like a stable couple moving toward the next stage of life. To our friends, we were dependable. Carolyn, the planner, and I, the steady one. I thought I had found someone who wanted the same pace I did. But that illusion cracked the night she slid a pregnancy test across the table and told me she was expecting. I still remember the exact night Carolyn told me she was pregnant. We were sitting across from each other at a small Italian place a few blocks from my apartment. She had barely touched her pasta. Her hands were shaking when she reached into her bag and slid a little white stick across the table. "Peter," she whispered, her voice trembling like she'd been rehearsing it. "We're having a baby." Carolyn covered her face with her hands, tears slipping between her fingers. She leaned over and hugged me, her voice breaking against my shoulder. "I can't believe this is happening. I've wanted this for so long. We're going to be a family." I wrapped my arms around her. I nodded. I even smiled. To anyone watching, I was the picture of a man whose life had just changed forever. But inside, I felt nothing close to joy. 2 years earlier, I'd made a permanent choice. After a bad scare in a different relationship, I had undergone a vasectomy. It wasn't something I broadcast, but it was a fact. Verified, documented, undeniable. Which meant one thing. This baby wasn't mine. When Carolyn finally pulled back, she wiped her eyes and gave me a look I hadn't seen before. The tears stopped quickly, replaced by a determined, businesslike tone. "We can't raise a child in your little apartment," she said, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "We need a real house, Peter, with space, a yard, a nursery, somewhere we can settle down." She said it like the decision had already been made, like the pregnancy automatically meant a mortgage, a neighborhood, and 18 years of responsibility. I stirred my drink, kept my face steady, and said, "You're right. We'll need to figure things out." That was the moment I decided I wouldn't confront her. Not yet. If Carolyn wanted to play this game, then I'd let her. I'd smile, nod, and let her believe she was in control. Because the truth was, she'd just walked herself into a trap she didn't even know existed. The night after her announcement, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open and a notepad on the table. I wasn't thinking about baby names or nursery colors. I was doing math. If Carolyn was telling the truth about when she found out, then conception would have happened roughly 9 weeks earlier. I traced the calendar backward. That placed it right on top of the weekend she had gone to Austin for a corporate training retreat. I remembered her excitement before the trip. New outfits, fresh haircut. The way she had said, "It'll be nice to get away, even if it's work." She had posted pictures on social media while she was there. Team dinners, rooftop drinks, smiling group photos. And in every single shot, there was one constant presence. David Collins, a senior guy from her office. He was always near her, sometimes with his hand on her shoulder, sometimes leaning in a little too close. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. The story was already writing itself. The next step came a few days later, when my bank app pinged me with a fraud alert. A charge for a boutique hotel in Austin had been flagged. It was tied to the joint account Carolyn and I sometimes used for travel. She had told me she was sharing a room with 2 coworkers to cut costs. That hotel charge said otherwise. I didn't confront her. I simply called my urologist the next morning. "I need a notarized copy of my vasectomy records," I said. The woman on the phone didn't ask questions. A week later, an envelope arrived, signed, sealed, and medically conclusive. Permanent sterility. At dinner that night, Carolyn leaned across the table, her eyes glowing. "I found a 3-bedroom listed just outside the city. Perfect schools, big backyard. We should schedule a viewing." I smiled, as if her words hadn't just confirmed my suspicions. "Sure," I said. "Let's take a look." Inside, I knew exactly what was happening. She thought she had leverage. She thought she was leading. She didn't realize I was already building my case, step by step, brick by brick. The following weeks turned into a parade of open houses. Carolyn would send me listings at all hours of the day. Her parents, Joyce and Edward Miller, quickly got involved. Joyce called one evening while I was finishing dinner. "Peter," she said, her voice full of enthusiasm, "you can't let this opportunity pass you by. Interest rates are climbing, and Carolyn deserves stability. A baby needs a proper home. I thanked her politely, assuring her that I wanted the same. What I didn't tell her was that the more pressure they applied, the calmer I became. The more they tried to push me into a corner, the more certain I was that patience would pay off. Each weekend, Carolyn and I drove from one property to the next. She would squeeze my arm and whisper, "This could be it, Peter. Imagine the baby crawling in this living room." I'd smile, take the realtor's card, and then, after she'd fallen asleep at night, I'd look for problems. Cracked foundations, suspicious inspection reports, and financing terms that would bury us. I always found a reason to stall. "Too much risk," I told her one Sunday after touring a house she adored. "The inspection shows water damage. We can't gamble with that." She frowned, frustrated. "You always find something wrong. Don't you want this baby to have a real home?" "I do," I said calmly. "That's why I won't rush into a mistake." Meanwhile, David Collins was becoming a regular figure. Carolyn mentioned him often, how supportive he'd been at work, how he even offered to help assemble furniture for the future nursery. One night, she invited him over to check out some shelving ideas. I watched him closely that evening, the way his eyes lingered on her, the way his smile stretched too wide. By the time spring rolled around, Carolyn's family had decided the baby deserved a grand celebration. Her mother announced it over Sunday dinner like it was a royal decree. "We'll host the gender reveal at the lake house," Joyce said, clapping her hands. "Everyone will be there. Friends, relatives, even Carolyn's colleagues. It will be perfect." Carolyn's eyes lit up, and she squeezed my hand under the table. "Isn't that wonderful, Peter? We'll finally show everyone our future." I nodded, sipping my wine. "Sounds like a good idea." Inside, I knew it was better than good. It was perfect. I offered to cover catering and suggested we set up a big photo wall to celebrate our journey. Joyce loved the idea. Carolyn was thrilled. Nobody suspected I had something different in mind. I began collecting photos, smiling selfies, vacation shots, even some from her Austin trip with colleagues. The dates would be printed beneath each picture, subtle reminders of when things happened. Meanwhile, the house hunt kept dragging. The final piece fell into place when Carolyn casually mentioned that David should be invited to the lake house event. "He's been such a rock for me through all this," she said, almost daring me to object. "Of course," I answered smoothly. "He's practically family now." She beamed, thinking she'd won another round. I said nothing more, but I knew the stage was set, the curtain was about to rise, and every actor was in place. The lake house was dressed up like something out of a magazine. Guests mingled, laughing, sipping champagne, snapping pictures. Carolyn looked radiant in a white summer dress, her hand resting on her stomach as relatives showered her with compliments. She played her role perfectly, the glowing mother-to-be. I kept mine just as polished. I shook hands with Edward's golf buddies, accepted congratulations from her cousins, and even laughed politely at David's jokes. He stood close to Carolyn most of the afternoon, always ready with a grin, always hovering like he belonged. An hour in, Joyce tapped a glass with a spoon, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Everyone, please, before we cut the cake, I'd like to ask Peter to say a few words." The chatter died down. All eyes turned to me. I rose slowly, champagne glass in hand, and smiled as if this were the proudest moment of my life. Carolyn looked at me, glowing with expectation. "Thank you all for being here," I began. "Today is about family, about trust, about celebrating new life. Carolyn and I are grateful for the love you've shown us." I let the pause hang. "But before we toast," I continued, "I'd like to acknowledge someone special, the person who made sure Carolyn was looked after during her trip to Austin." I turned toward David. "David Collins, thank you for being there when I couldn't." A ripple went through the crowd. David's smile faltered. Carolyn's eyes widened, her grip tightening on her glass. "And as for Carolyn," I said, reaching into my jacket, "I brought you something too." I pulled out the sealed envelope and handed it to her. "A notarized letter from my doctor, just in case you need it for the birth certificate." Silence spread like smoke. Carolyn's face drained of color. David froze in place. I lifted my glass one last time. To honesty, to family. Then I set the glass down, turned, and walked out the door without another word. I didn't stick around to watch the fireworks. I drove away from the lake house in complete silence, the envelope no longer in my pocket, the sound of stunned whispers fading in the distance. The details reached me in fragments later, carried by friends and mutual acquaintances who couldn't resist retelling the scene. The moment I left, the hush broke into chaos. Carolyn clutched the envelope against her chest, refusing to open it. Her father, Edward, wasn't as hesitant. He tore the flap and read the doctor's report aloud, his voice rising with each word. The room erupted. Carolyn sobbed, swearing it was a mistake, that I was lying, that the letter couldn't be real. But the signature was right there in black ink, notarized and official. There was no spin, no way out. All eyes turned to David. Under the weight of Joyce's disappointment, Edward's fury, and a dozen relatives' stares, he cracked. First denial, then stumbling excuses, then finally the truth. The affair, the trip, the pregnancy. Joyce cried into her hands. Edward cursed, his voice shaking with rage. Guests began leaving, some whispering to each other, some shaking their heads. What was meant to be a joyful reveal had dissolved into a public disaster. That night, Carolyn tried calling me. I didn't answer. The next morning, I froze our joint accounts. She had already tried to push a large transfer through for a down payment on a house I'd never agreed to buy. My lawyer helped draft a formal notice. I was not the father and would pursue legal action if she attempted to claim otherwise. Carolyn never replied. The house hunt ended overnight. The dream she'd been pushing so hard collapsed like a house of cards. For me, the silence was enough. I had said everything I needed to without raising my voice. Half a year passed before I finally allowed myself to look back. By then, the dust had settled, and the life Carolyn had tried to build on lies was gone. I heard she moved back into her parents' house. Their relationship was strained, though. They had been humiliated in front of their entire circle. Joyce barely spoke to her, and Edward avoided her altogether. From what I was told, they supported her financially because of the pregnancy, but the warmth was gone. As for David, he didn't stick around. Once the truth was out, whatever fantasy they had evaporated. But there are some things you can't walk away from. He was the father, and the law doesn't care about broken pride. He would face 18 years of responsibility whether he liked it or not. Me? I had taken steps the very next week. My attorney filed to ensure my name would never appear on the birth certificate. The judge signed off without hesitation. The medical records spoke for themselves. I walked out of that courthouse lighter than I had felt in years. The money Carolyn had pushed me to save for a down payment became something else entirely. I put part of it into a travel fund and the rest into a small workshop loft downtown. It wasn't fancy, but no one could leverage me into buying it. One afternoon, I boxed up the unopened baby gifts that had been delivered to my apartment before the lake house debacle. Strollers, blankets, tiny clothes. I drove them to a shelter for single mothers. As I carried each box inside, I felt the last remnants of Carolyn's scheme leave my hands. Looking back, my real revenge wasn't the toast. The toast was only the spark. The true victory was the months I let her believe she was in control, all while she built her own noose. In the end, Carolyn thought she was cornering me into a future I didn't choose. She didn't realize I was already 3 moves ahead. Sometimes silence, patience, and timing are sharper than any blade. And when the moment came, all I had to do was step aside and let the truth fall. Thank you for watching.